Hey Internet, today we're going to talk about synthesizers and synthesis after a few folks messaged me asking to learn a little more about it. Not only is this topic really cool and interesting from a music and audio experimentation standpoint, but with the advent and proliferation of procedural audio being used, it's definitely something you want to be aware of in the realm of game audio. So I put a PowerPoint together, let's hop in. Okay, types of synthesizers and how they work. Very brief outline of what we're going to look at. We're going to get a general understanding of what a synthesizer is, a brief history. We're going to look at waveforms and harmonics, components of synthesizers, and also the different types of synthesis. Not all of them, but a few of the most common types. So what is a synthesizer? Well, it creates vibrations just like any instrument. Any sound that we hear is a vibration in the air that can be caused by something physically moving. It can be caused by just air pressure in general. And synthesizers operate with vibrations being created in the form of an electrical signal. Synthesizers are really interesting in that we can manipulate an electrical signal in ways that we can't manipulate physical objects and bodies to create sound. So we can create some really interesting results with a synthesizer that we can't really do with other instruments. And there are also two main different types of synthesizers. We have modular as opposed to all-in-one, and we'll talk a little bit about it on the next slide. So, history of synthesizers. You can see kind of a progression here. We have the RCA Mark II, which is the first programmable sound synthesizer. And you can see a ton of chords in the background, basically connecting all of these different modules together. That is essentially you having a ton of different separate pieces of hardware that you are connecting that are all manipulating and editing the signal that's running through them. So you can create incredible, wonderful outputs by coming up with the craziest sort of route for your signal to take and for the different processing to be applied to it. Move forward a bit and we have the Moog synthesizer, which is more all-in-one. So instead of having all these different pieces of gear or all these different modules mounted on racks that you have to route a signal through, this essentially gives you all of the different options in one piece of gear. Now, there aren't nearly as many options if you have a all-in-one sort of synthesizer, but if you're someone that wants to be able to mess around with a synthesizer, learn what the different options are and begin to play much quicker, something like a Moog is much more accessible. And then the next evolution of the synthesizer that we have today is the soft synth or software synthesizer. So instead of having an actual electrical signal that we are manipulating with analog gear, we're essentially calculating and emulating the effects of all of this processing through software emulation. So, analog versus digital. Analog synthesizers use analog circuitry to generate a signal. So we are actually impacting an electrical signal directly, as opposed to digital synthesizers that use digital signal processing to generate a signal and essentially emulate the original analog effects on an electrical signal. Digital synths typically offer more features at a given price. They're just cheaper to produce nowadays. And certain types of synthesis that we'll look at are only possible with digital synthesizers. At its main core, a synthesizer needs to start with some type of signal. Many times that can be a waveform. Some of the simplest waveforms are shown right here. So synthesizers use alternating current to create their electrical signal. And you can think of each one of the axes of the images that we have here as being above the x-axis, thinking of it as compression or a speaker cone pushing on the air in front of it, and then below our axis being pulling on the air in front of the speaker cone, or rarefaction. So if we go through this process once, that is one waveform. So you can begin to understand what these waves actually mean. A much smoother change in direction as opposed to a very sudden one, or an even more sudden one like a square wave. But each of these sounds different each of them creates a different amount of harmonics and overtones, and each of them has a noticeably different timbre. So let's listen to some of these to understand what sort of effect it has. We'll start with a sine wave. There's that. Compare that to a square wave. Compared to a triangle. You can hear that triangle is kind of in between the square and the sine in terms of its timbre, right? And then we get into a sawtooth, which is, I think, has the most cutting, piercing quality to it. So the reason why these sound different is they each inherently excite different harmonics. And what a harmonic is the multiple of a fundamental frequency. So if we have a sine wave, it really doesn't produce any harmonics. So our original tone of 100 hertz really just generates that sound, and the harmonics really aren't audible. But when we get into other wave shapes, then it does generate those additional harmonics. So compare that to the sawtooth wave pictured below, where you can see that even though we're only playing 100 hertz, when we're playing 100 hertz as a sawtooth wave, it actually has a lot of content besides just that 100 hertz sound. And you can see it visualized there. And then beneath that is the triangle wave. So when we're thinking about the difference in terms of timbre between these different waves and how the sine wave seemed very smooth, the sawtooth seemed very sharp and cutting, and the triangle wave kind of sounded like in between them, visually that makes a lot of sense. So components of synthesis. There are synthesizers that play around with what its contents are, the order in which the signal passes through all of these different parts, but most synthesizers tend to have these elements to them. First off is an oscillator, which generates the original waveform that is then manipulated by other components. So this is what's actually making our waveform, our square wave, our sine wave, whatever it happens to be. Or it may be some sort of sampler that's taking white noise or some other sound, but it's generating some sort of waveform that we're then going to manipulate. We then have an amplifier that controls loudness pertaining to certain parameters within it, and within that we usually have an envelope. And if you look over to the right, you can see how specific we can get in terms of how our waveform or our sound is played back. We have the initial very beginning of the sound called the attack. Then we have the decay, which happens directly afterwards, and then sustain, or how that sound evolves over time. And then finally we have the release. So you'll see this shorthanded on many soft synth UIs as just ADSR, and it's assumed that you know what they mean. If you don't know what they mean, here's what they mean. And then usually there's some sort of filter or EQ as part of it to help shape the sound, and can be incredibly important for certain types of synthesis, especially subtractive synthesis. And then lastly, we will have effects, so reverb, phaser, chorus, or any other type of effect that we want to add, distortion, whatever it happens to be. So a couple different techniques for synthesis with all of our waveforms and all of our processing in mind, all produce different results. So the first one we're going to talk about is subtractive synthesis. It's primarily used by older analog synthesizers, and you essentially start with either a waveform or a audio sample of some kind, and then you use different EQ or filter shapes to subtract away what you want. So you can see up top we have a triangle wave with a fundamental pitch of 100 hertz and all of the harmonics above that 100 hertz. So that has more of a piercing quality than the image beneath it, where we still have a triangle wave at 100 hertz with a fundamental, but we've applied a low pass filter shape, so it's reducing a lot of the higher frequency content. So these are just going to sound different than one another. We also have additive synthesis. So this is combining a series of waveforms or sounds together and then getting a much more complex option from it. And I should note that what we talked about with subtractive synthesis, it can be something that's used in tandem with additive synthesis. So we don't have to start with just an audio file as a sample or a simple waveform. We can use additive synthesis to create a really complicated sound and then use subtractive synthesis to sculpt and mold it even further. This begins to get a little more, I don't want to say realistic, but at least a little less artificial feeling, in that the sounds created are just more complicated because we're not using only simple waveforms. Most sounds in nature are very, very complex. Even the simplest sounds that we hear on a day-to-day basis are usually hundreds, if not thousands, of different types of waves combined together in order to really accurately produce that sound. So we can add a lot of different waveforms, a lot of different sounds to this in order to make something really interesting. Then we also have FM synthesis, or frequency modulation synthesis. So it starts at its core, or its base, it's a combination of two waves. One wave being the waveform that we actually hear, which is called the carrier wave, and then the second wave being called the modulator. And we don't actually hear this second wave, but we hear its effect on the first wave. And what happens is we're just playing back our tone of, let's just use 880 hertz, and then we use the 220 hertz wave to modulate the pitch of our first wave here. So this can be a sine wave, a square wave, a sawtooth, whatever, what have you, and then we manipulate its pitch based off of the modulator wave. So it creates some really interesting timbres, especially if the time that we're allowing for this wave to impact our original carrier wave is very short. It becomes more of a timbral change as opposed to a change that is affecting pitch over time that you can actively hear. When we import this process, you'll see that the result is an irregular wave as opposed to both of these, which have a regular shape to both of them. And then the last type of synthesis we're going to talk about is granular synthesis. Let me get through here. So this is when we take either an audio sample or a waveform or whatever, what have you, and then we chop it up into very tiny bits, very small pieces. We're talking milliseconds of time, which we call grains. And then with each of these grains, we just do some crazy sort of processing to them. So that's pitch shifting, that's applying a plethora of effects, that is changing the loudness in them, that's doing a whole bunch of stuff that if we were to do by hand would take just far too much time, and we're not going to do it. But I have a video here that shows you a granular synthesizer in action, and you can see all of the different components at work and see the grains being produced, and also all of the different options being manipulated, so you can really understand what's going on with granular synthesis. wow, synthesis is so cool, right? This has been a introductory view into synthesis and synthesizers. I hope it was helpful to those that are interested in this topic. If you want some more game audio music implementation knowledge in your inbox every once in a while, be sure to hit the subscribe button. If you'd like some free music and sound effects, there's a link in the description of this video for you to sign up for our mailing list. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to throw them in the comments, and be sure to check out Unlock Audio. Thanks so much for watching.